There's something inside me that pulls beneath the surface. Sweet boy, don't let the movie take love, believe it. It's like you.
Today on Metal Icons, we are doing something that has never been done quite like this before. We are taking 14 of the most iconic rock and metal figures in history, and we are placing them directly against each other in the ultimate moral showdown. We are talking about Chester Bennington making a dying fan's wish come true hours before an international flight. We are talking about Gene Simmons openly bragging about licensing the Kiss brand to over 3,000 products. We are talking about Nikki Sixx losing a no-shower bet and having a woman get physically sick from the smell. We are talking about Brian Welch from Korn walking away from one of the biggest bands on the planet because Jesus walked into the room. We are talking about Dave Mustaine's justified fury after being fired from Metallica and watching them use his music anyway. We are talking about Eddie Vedder quietly writing a $10,000 check to a single mother of 6 who was about to lose her home at Christmas. We are going through Syd Barrett's heartbreaking collapse, Tom Morello's Harvard-educated relentlessness, Axl Rose's $13 million ego trip, Chris Cornell's legendary humility, Vince Neil's decades of destruction, Maynard James Keenan's almost supernatural patience, Elvis Presley's catastrophic excess, and Geddy Lee's quiet lifetime of discipline and moderation. 14 legends, 14 verdicts. Let's get into it. Chester Bennington, Linkin Park, versus Gene Simmons, Kiss.
There's something inside me that pulls beneath the surface. Sweet boy, don't let the movie take love, believe it.
When it comes to charity and rock music, the name that keeps coming up over and over again across decades is Chester Bennington of Linkin Park. Here is the story that defines him. In 2011, Chester was hours away from boarding a flight to Paris for a European tour. Not a day off, not a casual afternoon. Hours before an international flight with one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. And in that window, he learned that a dying fan's final wish was to meet him. Chester went. He showed up for that kid, a 14-year-old boy, and he sat with him. He talked with him. He made him feel seen at the moment in his life when that mattered more than anything else in the world. And Chester wasn't dragged there by a publicist or a PR team. This was who he was. Visiting people in need was a regular occurrence for Chester and the rest of Linkin Park. But Chester went further than most artists ever go. He was brutally open about his own mental health struggles, and he used that openness as a weapon against the stigma that was destroying people around him. He said it directly and publicly. All the kids out there who feel like they've been pushed down, picked on, looked at funny, feel strange because you're different. You know what that makes you? Cool. Don't let anybody make you feel bad for being who you are. Trust me, it gets better. That is not a press release. That is a man who lived through something dark, choosing to reach back and pull someone else through. Chester Bennington died in July 2017. He was 41 years old. In the wake of his passing, the One More Light Fund was established in his name to ensure that the legacy of giving he built over his entire career would continue beyond his life. Chester Bennington was the real thing. Now let's talk about Gene Simmons. Gene Simmons, bass player, co-founder of Kiss, and a man who has never once in his life been embarrassed to tell you exactly how much money he has made. Greed, as a deadly sin, is defined as an intense and selfish desire for something, most commonly wealth or power. And Gene Simmons doesn't just fit this definition. He has spent 50 years perfecting it into an art form. The Kiss brand has been licensed across more than 3,000 products. Read that number again. 3,000. It started with comic books and lunchboxes, which honestly, fine, that's rock and roll marketing. But it escalated. Kiss credit cards. And the one that nobody can quite get past, a Kiss branded coffin, an actual casket. so that the most devoted fans could be buried in Kiss merchandise. When asked how many caskets were sold, Gene's response was characteristically blunt. "I don't know, but they wrote a big check." And Gene has never once pretended this isn't exactly who he is. He brags about it, loudly, constantly. When asked to put a dollar figure on the Kiss empire, he said, "We make a living. 500 million? 750? A billion? Give me a cookie. $1 billion. Anywhere from 1 to 5. Gene Simmons is not conflicted about any of this. He has said flat out that making money is his favorite thing in life. And in a world where rock stars at least pretend to be above it all, and there is something almost clarifying about a man who just says the quiet part out loud every single time. Charity versus greed. Chester Bennington versus Gene Simmons. The contrast does not get more complete than this. Brian Welch, Korn versus Nikki Sixx, Motley Crue. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, Nikki Sixx and Motley Crue built a lifestyle that was so aggressively hedonistic, it reads today like a cautionary novel that no publisher would have accepted because the details are too unbelievable. He and Tommy Lee were infamous for their pursuit of groupies on the road. That part is well documented, and nobody in the band has ever denied it. But the stories go further than that. Nikki and Tommy once made a bet to see who could go the longest without showering while still attracting women. Nikki lost. The outcome involved a woman getting physically sick from the smell. He has told this story himself. He is not ashamed of it. Vince Neil added more color to the full picture of what touring with Motley Crue actually looked like. He described a scene at the studio where the band would buy egg burritos and use them to cover the smell of groupies before going back to their wives and girlfriends. Nobody in the group, by their own admission, thought to simply go to the restroom and clean up. That detail alone tells you everything you need to know about where their heads were. Nikki's marital history adds another dimension. In 1985, Nikki said publicly that without groupies, he probably would never have become a musician at all. He said he'd have gone home and become a farmer. He wrote Girls, Girls, Girls and Dr. Feelgood, which, given everything, makes complete sense. Now let's go somewhere completely different. Brian Welch, known as Head, co-founded Korn and helped build one of the most important bands in the history of nu metal. He was a rock star by every definition of the term, and he was also quietly being destroyed from the inside. Brian's struggle was with methamphetamine and pornography addiction, and he has spoken about both with extraordinary honesty. He described sitting at his computer on meth, disappearing into pornography for hours, and then feeling like the sickest person alive when it was over. The high masked it. The crash didn't. Brian has described what happened next as a physical, tangible experience. He felt, not saw, but felt, something he could only describe as the presence of Jesus coming into the room and wrapping arms around him. He said it felt like being home for the first time in his life. He left Korn. That decision shocked the rock world. The fans were stunned. His bandmates were devastated. But Brian walked away from one of the biggest active bands on the planet to get clean, to raise his daughter full-time, and to rebuild his life around his faith. 8 years later, he came back to Korn, not as the same person who left, but as a new one. Lust versus chastity. Nikki Sixx versus Brian Welch. Both men lived hard. Only one chose to change course. Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam, versus Dave Mustaine, Megadeth. Here is where it gets complicated, because Dave Mustaine's envy is arguably the most justified entry on this entire list. In the early 1980s, Metallica was forming. Dave Mustaine was one of the founding members. He was in the room when they were building something from nothing. He was talented, he was driven, and he was also, by his own admission, dangerously out of control. He was fighting with other members, showing up drunk, and eventually arrived at the studio in a state that made the decision for everyone. He was fired. What happened next is one of the most well-documented origin stories in metal history. Metallica went on to become one of the greatest bands in the world. Dave went on to form Megadeth. But the thing that has never fully left Dave, and that he has spoken about in interviews for decades, is the way things went down after the firing. The way the band talked about him, the quotes that circulated, that he was never really supposed to be there, that he was a temporary placeholder, a drunk, a loser, someone filling a spot. Dave has said clearly and directly, he agrees he should have been fired. His disease made him dangerous. He owns that. But what he has never been able to fully accept is the erasure, the deliberate attempt to write him out of the history he helped create. And here is where it gets interesting, because Dave Mustaine didn't let that envy consume him. He channeled it. He built Megadeth into one of the most successful thrash metal bands in the history of the genre. Multiple Grammy nominations, a New York Times best-selling book, a career that spans 4 decades and is still going. That is a man who has made peace with his envy. And maybe, just maybe, his story is proof that sometimes the sin drives the achievement. Now let's talk about Eddie Vedder. Kindness is the quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate. And Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam has been demonstrating it publicly and quietly for more than 30 years. In 2016, a woman posted online about her situation. She was a single mother of 6 children. She was on the verge of eviction. She had no money for Christmas presents. She wrote, "I'm trying my best. I pray every day, and now I'm begging for help. I know it's not about the gifts, but they're kids. I'm such a failure right now." Eddie Vedder saw that post. It hit him in a specific place, because the financial instability, the fear, the desperate attempt to hold a family together, it brought back his own childhood. He knew what that felt like from the inside. He sent the family $10,000, quietly, without a press tour. The story only got out because the woman shared it. A subsequent GoFundMe raised an additional $20,000 for the family. But that is one moment. Eddie's kindness is not a collection of moments. It is a continuous posture toward the world. Eddie Vedder has been a consistent, credible, and genuine human being in an industry that rewards the opposite. Envy versus kindness. Dave Mustaine versus Eddie Vedder. Tom Morello, Rage Against the Machine, versus Syd Barrett, Pink Floyd. Sloth is a lack of physical or spiritual effort. It is giving up on your potential. And the story of Syd Barrett is one of the most heartbreaking examples of that in rock history. Not because he chose to be idle, but because his illness made sustained effort impossible. Syd Barrett was the original frontman and primary songwriter of Pink Floyd. He was the creative engine in the early years, magnetic, inventive, utterly singular. And then the LSD use, compounded by an underlying and untreated mental illness, began to fracture him. By 1967, the band was watching Syd deteriorate in real time. He began missing rehearsals. He would stand on stage during live performances and simply not play. Strings slack, hands at his sides, staring into the crowd. The behavior became impossible to work around. In 1968, he was replaced by David Gilmour. The band, his friends, tried to help him record solo material afterward. Roger Waters and David Gilmour both went into the studio with him to try to produce his solo albums. It was, by their description, extremely difficult, disjointed. He was hard to reach, hard to direct, hard to get to do anything with consistency or intention. The albums came out. They achieved a degree of success. And then Syd retired from music entirely. Syd Barrett passed in 2006. He was 60 years old. He had been away from music for nearly 4 decades. Now, Tom Morello. If Syd Barrett is what it looks like when potential is unrealized, Tom Morello is what it looks like when a person decides, every single day, to refuse to accept any ceiling on what they are capable of. Diligence is persistent, focused, relentless hard work. And Tom Morello is not just diligent, he is the proof of concept that diligence actually works. He grew up as the only black kid in an all-white town. He was the only anarchist at a conservative high school. He went to Harvard University, graduated with a degree in political science, and was the only metal-shredding guitar player on that campus. He was self-taught. And then he got even better by practicing 8 hours a day while he was enrolled at one of the most academically demanding universities in the world. Let that sit for a second. And he invented techniques on the guitar that nobody had used before. The scratching, the sliding, the manipulation of the instrument that makes songs like Killing in the Name and Bulls on Parade immediately, unmistakably recognizable. Those sounds exist because Tom Morello sat down and did the work, relentlessly, for years, without a template for what he was building. Tom Morello has never stopped, not once. In a field where most people get comfortable after the first success, Tom Morello just keeps building. Diligence versus sloth. Tom Morello versus Syd Barrett. We are halfway through the most comprehensive moral breakdown in metal icons' history, and it only gets more intense from here. If this kind of deep dive content is what you come here for, do us a favor and share this video with one person who loves rock and metal history. It genuinely helps the channel grow and keeps us making content like this. Now, let's keep going. Chris Cornell, Soundgarden/Audioslave, versus Axl Rose, Guns N' Roses. And while Axl Rose is undeniably one of the most gifted rock vocalists who has ever lived, that talent has, at significant points in his career, fed an ego that has cost him enormously. The clearest example is Chinese Democracy. This is an album that took 15 years to make and cost over $13 million to produce. Slash, Izzy, and Duff, the core of what made Guns N' Roses, had no part in it. Axl worked with 15 different recording studios, 17 musicians, 10 producers, and 29 assistants. He attempted to manage most of the arrangements himself. The record was released in 2008 to mixed reviews and nowhere near the commercial impact of what the original lineup produced. And then came the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2012. Guns N' Roses were inducted. Slash and Duff showed up. They were there to perform. And Axl Rose, the frontman, the voice, the face, declined his induction entirely. He didn't want to be inducted under those circumstances. The public read it as exactly what it looked like, a man so focused on himself, on his current version of the band, on the narrative he wanted to control, that he could not stand in the same room with the people who helped build something historic. Axl cited touring reasons. The rock community mostly didn't buy it. Now, Chris Cornell. Humility is having a modest and accurate view of yourself. It is the freedom from arrogance that comes from genuinely valuing the contributions of the people around you. Chris Cornell built one of the most extraordinary careers in rock history with Soundgarden and later Audioslave. His voice was, and remains, widely regarded as among the greatest in rock music. He was a genuine legend, and he was also, by multiple accounts, one of the most grounded people anyone who knew him ever encountered. He talked openly about starting out working in a restaurant, starting as a dishwasher because, in his words, "I have no education, so that's what I was qualified for." A man who could sell out arenas describing himself as someone qualified to wash dishes. That is not false modesty. That is a person who remembered where he came from and chose not to let success rewrite his self-perception. Cornell's lyrics were deeply personal, about vulnerability, about struggle, about the difficulty of being human. He didn't hide behind the mythology. He wore his uncertainty openly. That openness was not a weakness. And it was one of the reasons people connected to his music so profoundly. Humility versus pride. Chris Cornell versus Axl Rose. Maynard James Keenan, Tool, versus Vince Neil, Motley Crue. Wrath is intense, uncontrolled, destructive anger. And Vince Neil of Mötley Crüe has a public record that spans multiple decades and demonstrates what wrath looks like when it is never addressed. The foundational event is December 8, 1984. Vince Neil got behind the wheel of his car while drunk. The crash that followed killed Hanoi Rocks drummer Nicholas Razzle Dingley and seriously injured 2 other people. Vince was convicted of vehicular manslaughter. He served 15 days in jail and was ordered to pay $2.5 million in damages. His bandmates have since acknowledged that all of them were driving drunk in that era constantly. But Tommy Lee had been in a bad car accident. Mick Mars had been in one too. It was, by their admission, something they all knew needed to stop, and after Razzle's death, they said they tried to change. Vince Neil did not change. And then there is the incident involving Nicolas Cage, which remains one of the more surreal entries in rock music criminal history. A woman reportedly wanted Cage's autograph. Vince Neil allegedly attacked her. Nicolas Cage restrained Vince Neil. When that happened, Vince Neil is a man who has had every possible reason to moderate his behavior, legal consequences, personal tragedy, the death of a human being directly caused by his choices, and has, across 4 decades, continued to respond to the world with the same unchecked aggression. Now let's talk about Maynard James Keenan. Patience is the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, difficulty, or frustration without losing composure or direction. And Maynard James Keenan operates on a time scale that most human beings cannot comprehend. He runs Tool, A Perfect Circle, and Pucifer simultaneously. 3 active bands with 3 distinct sounds and 3 separate fan bases. That alone requires a level of coordination and patience that most musicians never have to develop. Offstage, Maynard's patience is equally evident, but in completely different domains. He holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a discipline that rewards nothing but sustained, methodical effort over years and years of practice. You cannot shortcut a black belt. There is no hack. You show up, you get submitted. You come back, and you do it again, for years. He also owns and operates several vineyards in Arizona, producing wine under multiple labels. Winemaking is not a quick return industry. You plant, you wait, you tend, you wait more, you harvest, you wait again. Maynard has built an entire second career around a process that requires exactly the quality he brings to Tool: the willingness to let something take as long as it actually needs to take. Patience versus wrath. Maynard James Keenan versus Vince Neil. Geddy Lee, Rush versus Elvis Presley. Elvis entered the U.S. Army in 1958. It was during that period that he became heavily dependent on amphetamines. That dependency did not end when his service did. It traveled with him back into civilian life and straight into the center of one of the most celebrated careers in music history. In 1973, Elvis suffered a near-fatal overdose. This was not the moment that changed things. The prescription rates continued to climb. In 1977 alone, the year he died, Elvis was prescribed 10,000 doses of amphetamines, narcotics, and sedatives. His personal physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, had his medical license revoked as a result. It was later revealed that Dr. Nikopoulos had prescribed Elvis 19,000 doses in just 31 months. But the substances were only part of it. Elvis's eating habits in his final years are equally staggering. He averaged over 10,000 calories per day. Peanut butter and banana sandwiches fried in butter. Breakfast plates piled with bacon, sausage, eggs, and grits. Dessert? Always. His weight at the time of his death is estimated at around 350 pounds. He died on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42. Elvis Presley's final years are not the story of a rock star who burned brightly and crashed. They are the story of a man consumed by excess in every direction at once, with no one around him able or willing to stop it. His appetite was not just for food or drugs. It was a consuming total overindulgence in everything, a lifestyle with no breaks and no off switch. He is, as a case study in gluttony, without equal. Now, Geddy Lee. Geddy Lee is the frontman, bassist, and keyboardist of Rush, one of the most technically sophisticated rock bands in history and one of the longest-running active rock bands ever assembled. He has been playing and performing at the highest level for over 50 years. And here is what makes Geddy Lee remarkable in the context of this list. In the 1970s and 1980s, when every band on their level was defined at least in part by the excess that went on backstage, Rush was defined by what they chose not to do. Geddy Lee is not the guy who avoided excess because he lacked access to it. He is the guy who had full access and made a different choice, consistently over the course of an entire career. He has been married to his wife Nancy since 1976. That is 50 years. In an industry where marriages last months, Geddy Lee built a partnership that has lasted half a century. In 2021, Geddy Lee received a Lifetime Achievement Award for philanthropy, recognition for decades of charitable giving that he conducted largely without making it the centerpiece of his public identity. Temperance versus gluttony. Geddy Lee versus Elvis Presley. The discipline of a lifetime versus the collapse of one. So there it is, 14 legends, 7 deadly sins, 7 heavenly virtues, and a picture of rock and roll that is more complicated, more human, and more honest than the mythology usually allows. Rock and roll was never supposed to be comfortable. It was never supposed to be clean. But the greatest figures in its history weren't great because they broke every rule. They were great because the music they made, in the middle of all that chaos, was real. That is the thing about this genre. It does not lie. It cannot. The greatest rock and metal will always tell you exactly who made it and exactly what they were going through when they did. If you made it to the end of this one, you are exactly the kind of fan that Metal Icons exists for. Drop a comment below. Tell us which comparison surprised you the most. Tell us who you think we got wrong. Tell us who should have been on this list that we left off. We read every comment and we take all of it into account when we build the next video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who loves rock history as much as you do. This is Metal Icons. We will see you in the next one.